Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you will chill you to the bone. This is the story of Private Thomas Mitchell, a 22-year-old farm boy from Iowa who enlisted in 1943, believing he'd come home a hero. Instead, he came home hearing voices. Dead voices. Specifically, one voice that would haunt him for the rest of his days. But here's the thing that'll make your blood run cold. The voice wasn't speaking English. The rain hammered down on the muddy trenches of northern France like bullets from heaven, each drop exploding into the already waterlogged earth beneath Thomas's boots. November 1944. The war was supposed to be winding down, they said. Victory was within reach, they said. But tell that to the German machine gunners dug in just 200 yards across no man's land, spitting death at anyone foolish enough to show their helmet above the parapet. Thomas pressed his back against the cold, wet wall of the trench, his rifle clutched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Around him, his fellow soldiers huddled like ghosts in their mud-caked uniforms, their eyes hollow and distant. These weren't the same bright-faced boys who'd shipped out from Camp Pendleton 6 months ago. War had a way of stealing youth, replacing it with something harder, colder. "Mitchell," Sergeant O'Brien's voice cut through the drumming rain like a blade. "You and Jackson are on patrol duty. Intelligence says Jerry's been moving supplies through Sector 7. We need eyes on that position." Thomas felt his stomach drop. Night patrol meant crawling through no man's land, through the twisted metal and decomposing bodies that littered the space between the opposing forces. It meant becoming intimate with death in ways no farm boy from Iowa should ever have to experience. "Sarge, with respect," Private Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Visibility's near zero out there. We'll be crawling blind." O'Brien's weathered face showed no sympathy. "That's exactly why Jerry won't expect it. Move out in 10 minutes. Radio silence unless you spot movement. And boys," his eyes fixed on each of them in turn, "remember, better to come back with nothing than not come back at all." As Jackson checked his gear, Thomas closed his eyes and tried to remember his father's farm, the smell of fresh hay in the barn, the sound of his mother humming while she prepared Sunday dinner, the feeling of clean sheets and a warm bed. But the memories felt distant now, like looking at photographs of someone else's life. The wire cutters felt cold and foreign in Thomas's hands as he and Jackson slipped over the trench wall into the hellscape beyond. The first thing that hit you in no man's land wasn't the sight, it was the smell. Death had a particular odor that clung to everything. Sweet, metallic, and utterly final. Bodies in various states of decay dotted the landscape like grotesque scarecrows, some still wearing the uniforms that once meant something to mothers and wives back home. They moved like shadows, bellies pressed against the mud, using shell craters for cover. Every few yards they'd freeze, listening for any sound that didn't belong. A cough, the click of a rifle bolt, the whisper of German voices. But tonight, the only sounds were the rain and the distant rumble of artillery from other sectors. 50 yards out, Jackson grabbed Thomas's sleeve and pointed. There, barely visible through the rain and mist, was a German observation post. Thomas could make out the silhouette of a German helmet, motionless behind a mounted scope. For a moment, neither American moved, afraid that even breathing might give them away. That's when Thomas saw him. A German soldier, maybe 19 years old, was crawling toward their position from the east. He moved with purpose, probably carrying a message between German positions. In the pale light filtering through the clouds, Thomas could see the boy's face clearly. Smooth cheeks, brightened eyes, probably thinking about his own mother back in Bavaria or Berlin. Thomas raised his rifle. His training kicked in automatically. Sight picture, breath control, gentle squeeze of the trigger. The German boy never saw it coming. The shot cracked through the night like thunder. The German boy pitched forward into the mud, his message pouch spilling its contents into a puddle that quickly turned red. For a moment, everything was silent except for the rain. Then the boy moved. Thomas watched in horror as the German soldier pushed himself up on his elbows, turned his head, and looked directly at him. Blood streamed from a wound in his chest, black in the moonlight. His lips moved, forming words that carried impossibly clearly across the 50 yards of muddy earth between them. "Warum?" the boy whispered, his voice somehow audible over the rain. "Warum hast du mich getötet?" Thomas didn't speak German, but he understood the tone. The boy was asking, why? Why did you kill me? "Jesus Christ!" Jackson hissed, grabbing Thomas's arm. "We need to move, now. That shot's gonna bring every Jerry in the sector down on us." But Thomas couldn't move. He stared at the German boy, who was still looking at him, still whispering questions in a language Thomas never learned, but somehow understood in the deepest part of his soul. The boy's eyes held no anger, no hatred, just confusion, just the terrible, innocent question of a child who couldn't understand why his life was ending in a muddy field so far from home. "He's still moving," Thomas whispered. Jackson looked toward the German position and shook his head. "He's dead, Tom. Dead men don't move. It's just nerves, muscle spasms. We need to go." But as they crawled back toward their own lines, Thomas could still hear it, soft as a whisper, persistent as his own heartbeat. "Warum? Warum hast du mich getötet?" The other soldiers slept peacefully around him, but Thomas remained wide awake, listening to a dead boy ask him questions he couldn't answer. And deep down, in a place he didn't want to examine too closely, Thomas began to suspect this was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new horrors, new questions, and the growing realization that some voices, once heard, never fade away. "They follow you home." 3 days passed, and Thomas Mitchell thought maybe it had been his imagination. Combat stress, the medics called it. Shell shock. But on the 4th night, as he lay in his muddy foxhole, trying to catch a few hours of sleep before the morning offensive, the voice came back, and this time it wasn't alone. The whispers started so softly that Thomas almost missed it beneath the constant patter of rain on his helmet. But there it was, drifting through the darkness like smoke from a dying fire. Thomas Mitchell. His eyes snapped open. The voice was speaking English now, but with that same young German accent, pronouncing each syllable carefully, as if the words were unfamiliar on his tongue. "I have been waiting for you to listen," the voice continued, somehow intimate, despite coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You know my name now, Klaus Dietrich. I was 19 years old. I had a sister named Emma." Thomas sat up slowly in his foxhole, his heart hammering against his ribs. Around him, his fellow soldiers slept the exhausted sleep of men pushed beyond their limits. Corporal Williams snored softly 10 feet away. Private Murphy mumbled his girlfriend's name in his sleep. Everything was normal. Everything was as it should be, except for the dead German boy who was somehow speaking perfect English in Thomas's ear. "You are wondering how I know your language now," Klaus's voice continued, and I could swear I heard something like amusement in it. "Death is a very good teacher, Thomas Mitchell. Death teaches you many things. It teaches you that borders are just lines on maps. It teaches you that uniforms are just cloth. Most importantly, it teaches you to speak the language of guilt." Thomas pressed his hands against his ears, but the voice didn't come from outside. It lived somewhere deeper, somewhere that hands couldn't reach. "Stop!" Thomas whispered into the darkness. "You're dead! I saw you die! This isn't real!" "Real?" Klaus's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "What is real in this place, Thomas? Is the mud real? Is the blood? Is the fear that eats at you every morning when you wake up and remember where you are? Yes, I am dead, but you are the one who made me this way. Does that not create a connection between us? The next morning brought the usual chaos of war. Artillery bombardments at dawn, followed by the order to advance across 200 yards of open ground toward the German positions. Thomas moved with his unit, but his mind felt disconnected from his body, as if he were watching someone else's war through thick glass. During the charge, as bullets whined overhead and explosions threw mud and worse things into the air around him, Thomas found himself looking for Klaus's body. But the shell craters had been shifted by the bombardment, and the corpses had been moved or buried or simply blown to pieces, too small to recognize. "You will not find me there," Klaus's voice said calmly, as Thomas dove into a shell hole for cover. "I am here now," and Thomas felt a cold presence settle beside him in the crater, invisible but undeniably there. The offensive failed. Half of Thomas's company became casualties in the first hour, and the survivors limped back to their starting positions with nothing to show for their effort except fresh nightmares and new names for the casualty reports. That evening, as the medics tended to the wounded and Sergeant O'Brien counted heads, Private Jackson approached Thomas with concern etched deep in his face. "Tom, you've been acting strange since that patrol. During the charge today, I saw you talking to yourself. The other boys are starting to notice." Thomas looked around at his fellow soldiers. They were all damaged in their own ways. Murphy's hands shook constantly now. Williams junked at every sound, and Henderson had developed a stutter that got worse with each passing day. But they were all still fundamentally present, still occupying the same reality as everyone else. "I'm fine," Thomas lied. "Just tired." But Jackson wasn't buying it. "Listen, there's a field psychiatrist coming through next week. Maybe you should talk to him. There's no shame in it, Tom. This war's been hard on all of us." That night, Thomas volunteered for guard duty. He told himself it was to prove he was still reliable, still capable of doing his job. But the truth was darker. He wanted to be alone with the voice, to understand what was happening to him. Klaus didn't disappoint. "Your friend is worried about you," the voice observed, as Thomas settled into his watch position, overlooking no man's land. "He is a good friend. He reminds me of my friend Hans. We grew up together in a small village outside Munich. Hans wanted to be a baker, like his father. I wanted to be a teacher." "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas whispered into the darkness. "Because you need to know who you killed. Not what, who. I was not just the uniform with a rifle. I was a person with dreams, with people who loved me. My mother still looks out the window every evening, waiting for me to come home from the war. She does not know yet that I will never walk through that door again." Thomas felt tears on his cheeks, cold in the night air. "I was just doing my job, following orders. You would have killed me if you had seen me first." "Yes," Klaus agreed readily. "I would have. And if I had, perhaps you would be the voice in my ear now, telling me about your farm in Iowa, about your parents who raised corn and hoped their son would come home safely. War makes killers of us all, Thomas Mitchell. But killing leaves marks on the soul, whether the killing is right or wrong." Over the following nights, the conversations continued. Klaus told Thomas about his childhood, about summer afternoons swimming in a river that Thomas couldn't pronounce, about Christmas mornings and his mother's apple strudel, and the girl named Greta who had kissed him goodbye when he left for the war. And slowly, something terrible began to happen. Thomas Thomas started to care about Klaus Dietrich, started to mourn him, started to feel the full weight of what he had taken from the world when he pulled that trigger. "You are learning," Klaus observed one night. "You are beginning to understand what death means. Not just the ending of breath, but the ending of stories. All the conversations I will never have with Emma, all the children I will never teach, all the mornings I will never wake up to see the sun rise over my village." The other soldiers began to worry openly now. Thomas had grown gaunt and hollow-eyed, talking to himself during quiet moments, flinching at sounds no one else could hear. Sergeant O'Brien pulled him aside after a particularly bad episode. "Mitchell, I'm putting you on light duty. No more patrols, no more combat missions. You're going to help with supplies and communications until the doc can take a look at you." Thomas nodded numbly. Part of him felt relief, but a larger part felt shame. He was letting his unit down, becoming a liability instead of an asset. That night, as he lay in his foxhole, listening to Klaus describe the sound of church bells in his hometown, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. "Klaus," Thomas whispered into the darkness, "what do you want from me? Why won't you leave me alone?" The silence stretched so long that Thomas thought the voice might finally be gone. Then Klaus spoke, and his words carried a weight that seemed to press down on Thomas's soul. "I want you to remember me, Thomas Mitchell. I want you to carry my story home with yours. But most of all," the voice paused, and when it continued, it was barely above a whisper, "I want you to understand that there are others here, so many others, and they all have voices. They are all waiting to speak." And in that moment, Thomas realized the horrible truth. Klaus Dietrich was not the only dead voice in no man's land. He was just the first one brave enough to reach across the divide between life and death. The others were coming. They came like a flood of whispers in the night. Voices speaking in German, French, Russian, and languages Thomas had never heard before. Each one had a name, a story, a life that had been cut short in this God-forsaken stretch of mud between two armies. And Klaus Dietrich, the first voice, the one who had opened the door, became their translator. But translation, Thomas was about to learn, was the least of his problems. The breakdown began during what should have been a routine supply run. Thomas was carrying ammunition boxes from the rear positions to the front lines when the voices started overlapping, creating a chorus of the dead that made his knees buckle under the weight of more than just military supplies. Pierre Dubois, age 24, killed by shrapnel 3 weeks ago. He was going to marry his childhood sweetheart when he returned to Marseille. Her name was Claudette. Then another voice, speaking rapid French that somehow made perfect sense to Thomas. "She wore a blue dress the last time I saw her, blue like the Mediterranean in summer. Does she still wait for me? Does she know I am gone? And this is Dmitri Volkov," Klaus continued, as Thomas pressed his palms against his temples, trying to block out the growing cacophony of the dead. "He died in the winter offensive, froze to death in a shell crater, calling his mother's name. 'Mama, I am so cold, Mama. Why is it still so cold?'" Thomas sank to his knees in the mud, ammunition scattered around him like broken promises. Other soldiers rushed to help him, but their voices seemed distant and muffled compared to the crystal clarity of the dead. "Mitchell, what's wrong with you?" Corporal Williams demanded, but Thomas could barely hear him over the growing chorus of ghosts. "So many stories," Klaus observed, his voice cutting through the others with terrible clarity. "Each one ending too soon, each one leaving people behind who will never know what became of their loved ones. Do you see now, Thomas Mitchell? Do you understand the weight of what we carry?" The medic, a tired-looking man named Peterson, knelt beside Thomas and shone a flashlight in his eyes. "Looks like combat fatigue," he said to Williams. "Get him back to the aid station. I'll radio for a psych eval." But as they carried Thomas away, the voices followed, growing louder and more insistent. Klaus remained their interpreter, their bridge between the world of the dead and the mind of the living. Wilhelm Hoffmann, machine gunner, dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, Klaus said, as Thomas was strapped to a stretcher. Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, resistance fighter, had 3 children who will grow up without their father. Alexei Petrov, sniper, wrote poetry in the margins of his ammunition reports. The aid station was a converted church in a bombed-out village 3 miles behind the lines. Thomas lay on a cot between 2 wounded soldiers, one missing his left arm, the other muttering about rats in the trenches, and tried to explain to the psychiatrist what was happening to him. Dr. Harrison was a kind man, with tired eyes and gentle hands that had seen too much war. He listened patiently as Thomas tried to describe the voices, the stories, the growing sense that he was carrying the weight of dozens of dead soldiers in his mind. "It's not uncommon," Dr. Harrison said finally. "The human mind can only process so much trauma before it finds creative ways to cope. These voices you're hearing, they're your psyche's way of dealing with the guilt of killing, the horror of what you've witnessed." "But they know things," Thomas insisted. "Things I couldn't possibly know. Klaus told me he had a sister named Emma, and when I killed him, there was a letter from her in his message pouch. I saw it. The letter talked about their village, about people he'd mentioned to me." Dr. Harrison made notes on his clipboard. "The mind is remarkably good at picking up details we don't consciously register. You might have glimpsed that letter without realizing it, and your subconscious incorporated those details into your hallucinations." But Thomas knew it was more than that. As night fell over the aid station, the voices returned in force. Klaus's voice rose above the others, no longer the confused young soldier from that first night, but something older and more knowing. "The doctor is a good man," Klaus said, his voice seeming to come from the empty cot beside Thomas. "He wants to help you, but he cannot help with this, Thomas Mitchell. This is not a sickness of the mind. This is a sickness of the soul." "What do you want from me?" Thomas whispered, careful not to wake the other patients. "Because you are the bridge. You are the one who can hear us, who can carry our stories forward. Most soldiers kill and forget, or they kill and are haunted by nameless guilt. But you see us as we truly were. You understand that every trigger pull ends not just a life, but a universe of possibilities." Thomas closed his eyes, but that only made the voices clearer. They came in waves now. German soldiers he'd killed during the advance, enemy dead from battles he'd never fought in, voices speaking languages from wars he'd never heard of. "This is madness," Thomas breathed. "No," Klaus said firmly. "Madness would be easier. Madness would be simple hallucinations that doctors could treat with rest and medication. This is something else entirely. This is consequence." Over the next 3 days, Thomas tried everything to make the voices stop. He begged Dr. Harrison for stronger medication. He tried exhausting himself with physical exercise until he collapsed. He even attempted to damage his hearing, thinking that maybe if he couldn't hear anything, the voices would finally be silenced. Nothing worked. If anything, the voices grew stronger, more insistent. Klaus began describing other soldiers in the aid station, revealing details about their lives that Thomas had no way of knowing. He spoke about William's secret drinking problem, about Murphy's recurring nightmares about his dead brother, about Henderson's growing plans to desert. And then Klaus began describing the staff. "Nurse Catherine has a son in the Pacific Theater. She has not heard from him in 6 weeks. She prays for him every night before sleep, but she is beginning to lose hope. Dr. Harrison lost his own son at Normandy. This is why he works so hard to save other people's children. He carries a photograph of the boy in his left breast pocket, but he has not looked at it in 3 months because it hurts too much." Thomas tried to dismiss these as more hallucinations, but when he watched the staff the next day, he saw the truth in Klaus's words. The way Nurse Catherine's hand trembled when she sorted the mail. The way Dr. Harrison unconsciously touched his left breast pocket whenever a young soldier died. "See," Klaus said, "the dead know things that the living try to hide. We see the connections, the patterns, the invisible threads that bind every story to every other story. You killed me, Thomas Mitchell, but in doing so, you opened the door. Now you see what we see. Now you carry what we carry." That night, as Thomas lay staring at the ceiling of the converted church, Klaus made him an offer that would change everything. "There is a way to quiet the voices," Klaus said. "Not silence them. They will always be with you now, but bring them peace. You must give them what they need most." "What's that?" Thomas asked. Klaus's response came like a whisper of wind through autumn leaves. "You must go home, Thomas Mitchell. You must find the families we left behind. You must tell them we are sorry for leaving. You must tell them we loved them until the very end. You must deliver the messages we never got to send." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. "That's impossible. There are dozens of you now, maybe hundreds. I can't find every family in Germany and Russia and France and—" "Not all of them," Klaus interrupted gently. "Just the ones who speak loudest. Just the ones whose stories demand to be told, starting with mine." And in that moment, Thomas understood the true horror of his situation. The voices weren't just random hallucinations brought on by combat stress. They were assignments, missions, a lifetime of carrying messages from the dead to the living, from the battlefield to the home front, from the place where stories end to the places where people wait forever for letters that will never come. The war would end eventually, Thomas realized, but his war, the war between the living and the dead, was just beginning.
The war ended on May 8, 1945. Church bells rang across Europe. Soldiers wept with relief, and the world began the long process of healing. But for Thomas Mitchell, sitting in a displacement camp in Belgium, with discharge papers in his pocket and a head full of dead voices, the real war was just beginning. Because Klaus Dietrich had kept his promise, and the dead, Thomas was learning, always keep their promises. The ship home was called the USS Liberty, and Thomas spent most of the Atlantic crossing standing at the rail, watching the dark water and listening to Klaus describe his village in Bavaria. Not the way a tourist guide might describe it, but the way a homesick boy remembers every detail of the place he'll never see again. "There is a bakery on the main street," Klaus said, his voice now as familiar to Thomas as his own heartbeat. "Herr Weber makes the best pretzels in 3 counties. Emma and I used to save our pfennigs to buy them on market days. The shop smells like yeast and cinnamon, and in winter, steam fogs the windows so thick you have to wipe them clean to see inside." "Stop," Thomas whispered, gripping the ship's rail so tightly his knuckles went white. "I can't do this. I can't go to Germany. I can't face his family." "You can," Klaus replied with gentle certainty. "You must. But first, you go home. You see your parents. You try to be the son they remember. And when you are ready, when you have remembered what it feels like to be among the living, then you begin carrying messages for the dead." The farm in Iowa looked exactly the same, but Thomas felt like he was viewing it through thick glass. His mother cried when she saw him. His father shook his hand with eyes bright with pride, and his younger sister Sarah chattered excitedly about all the things that had happened while he was gone. But Thomas could barely focus on their words over the constant whisper of voices that had grown to include not just enemy dead, but American soldiers too, boys he'd served with who hadn't made it home. "Bobby Martinez wants his mother to know he wasn't afraid when he died," Klaus translated one evening, as Thomas sat on the front porch watching the sunset over the cornfields. Thomas's mother found him the next morning, passed out on the porch swing, with tears dried on his cheeks. She called Dr. Peterson, the local physician who delivered Thomas and set his broken arm when he was 8 years old. "Combat fatigue," Dr. Peterson diagnosed after a brief examination. "I've seen it in several of the boys who've come home. Give him time, Mary. Give him patience. The war leaves marks that don't show on the outside." But Thomas knew no amount of time would heal what was wrong with him. The voices were getting stronger, not weaker, more insistent. Klaus had become their leader, their spokesman, and he was growing impatient with Thomas's reluctance to begin his mission. 3 months after returning home, Thomas made his decision. He sold his share of the farm to his father, kissed his family goodbye, and booked passage on a freight ship bound for Hamburg. His parents thought he was going to Europe to study, to use his GI benefits for education abroad. He let them believe it. The truth would have broken their hearts. Germany in 1946 was a shattered landscape of bombed-out cities and displaced people. Thomas traveled by train and truck and sometimes on foot, following Klaus's increasingly specific directions toward a village called Oberammergau, nestled in the Bavarian Alps. "Turn left at the church with the broken bell tower, Klaus instructed as Thomas walked through the village center. My house is the third one on the right, with blue shutters and the garden where my mother grows vegetables. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 50 years old, with Klaus's same gentle eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She looked at Thomas with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust unexpected visitors, especially American soldiers. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? She asked carefully. No, ma'am, but I have a message for you from your son, from Klaus. The woman's face went pale. She spoke rapidly in German, and though Thomas couldn't understand the words, he recognized the tone. Desperate hope mixed with terrible fear. She wants to know if you have news about Klaus. Klaus translated. She has heard nothing official. She still hopes he might be in a prisoner camp somewhere, that he might still come home. Thomas looked into this mother's eyes, Klaus's eyes, and felt his heart break. Mrs. Dietrich, I need to tell you about your son. What followed was the most difficult conversation of Thomas's life. With Klaus translating, Thomas was able to communicate with Mrs. Dietrich in her own language, but every word felt like swallowing broken glass. He told her how Klaus had died, quickly, without pain, and he delivered the messages Klaus had been saving for 3 years. Tell her I was thinking of her apple strudel when I died, Klaus whispered, and Thomas repeated it in halting German. Tell her I was not afraid because I knew I would see Papa again. Tell her that Emma must not blame herself for the argument we had before I left. I forgave her the moment I walked out the door. Frau Dietrich wept, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of relief, of closure, of finally knowing. She brought out photographs of Klaus as a child, told Thomas stories about his kindness to animals and his dream of becoming a teacher, and slowly something miraculous began to happen. Klaus's voice grew quieter, more peaceful. She understands now, he said, as his mother showed Thomas a letter Klaus had written but never sent, found among his belongings. She knows I did not suffer. She knows I thought of home. The anger is leaving her heart, Thomas Mitchell. The wondering is over. Over the following months, Thomas traveled across Europe, guided by the voices of the dead, to farmhouses and apartments and refugee camps. He found Pierre Dubois' fiancée Claudette working as a nurse in Lyon and delivered Pierre's final words of love. He located Dmitry Volkov's mother in a displaced persons camp outside Berlin and told her that his son had spoken of her borscht with his dying breath.
The last message took him back to Iowa, to a small house in Des Moines where Bobby Martinez's mother lived with her 3 daughters, and the hope that her eldest son might still walk through the front door someday. Mijo, she whispered, when Thomas finished telling her about Bobby's final moments, using the Spanish endearment Klaus somehow knew to translate. My little boy. He was always so brave, always taking care of everyone else. As Mrs. Martinez wept for her son, Thomas felt the last of the urgent voices finally settle into peace. Klaus's presence, which had been his constant companion for 4 years, began to fade like morning mist. It is finished, Klaus said, his voice barely a whisper now. All the messages have been delivered. All the stories have been told. The families know their loved ones did not die forgotten and alone. What happens now? Thomas asked, speaking aloud for the first time in months, without caring who might hear. Now you live, Klaus replied, his voice growing fainter with each word. You carry our memories, but you do not carry our deaths. You remember that life is precious because you have seen how easily it ends. You love deeply because you know how final goodbye can be. And then, for the first time in 4 years, Thomas Mitchell experienced something he had almost forgotten: silence. Not the empty silence of loneliness, but the peaceful silence of completion. The voices were still there, would always be there, but they spoke now in whispers of gratitude rather than screams of anguish. Thomas returned to Iowa in 1950, a changed man, but no longer a broken one. He married Sarah Henderson, a schoolteacher who understood that some silences contained more truth than words ever could. He taught farming at the agricultural college, wrote letters to the families he had found in Europe, and raised 3 children who grew up knowing that every life is a story worth remembering. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blew just right across the cornfields, Thomas would hear Klaus's voice one more time, not desperate now, not pleading, but simply grateful. Grateful for the messages delivered, the stories told, and the bridge built between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Because in the end, that's all any of us really want, to be remembered, to know that our stories mattered, to believe that somewhere, someone carries a piece of who we were into tomorrow. The enemy's voice taught Thomas Mitchell the most important lesson of all. In death, as in life, we are all more alike than different. We all love, we all fear, we all hope, and we all deserve to be heard.